Welcome. I'm your host, Matt, and you're listening to Homicidal Tendency. Join me as we explore the darker side of the rainbow, as we dissect the grit of queer true crime and the gore of our favorite horror flicks. It's scary, it's campy, and it's always killer. I'm so glad you decided to join me for episode 4. If you like the show, let your friends know and give me a 5-star rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your platform of choice. It really helps the show beat the algorithm. Also, if you want, follow me on Instagram, Blue Sky, Tumblr, or TikTok at Homicidal Tendency. Whether you're a returning listener or just discovering us for the first time, prepare yourself. Today, we're diving into a wild case that challenges everything we think about when we think about a normal existence. There is a trigger warning for this episode. This episode contains descriptions of animal cruelty, cannibalism, child abuse, child murder, derogatory terms towards mentally disabled people, and yeah, that's a list, right? Listener discretion is advised. So lock your doors, turn down the lights, and let's get into it. In the woods of Maryland, there's a certain kind of silence, one that usually feels peaceful. But in the early 1990s, that silence became heavy with the things the earth was hiding. To his neighbors, Hadden Clark was a nuisance, a social outcast who lived in his truck, a man who seemed to have no place in the world. But Hadden had a secret, or rather, Hadden had Kristen. Kristen was the woman Hadden claimed that lived inside him, the woman he would dress as before he went hunting. Today, we're looking at a case that blurs the line between mental illness, gender identity, a fantasy legacy of blood. This is the story of the cross-dressing cannibal, Hadden Clark. So, let's meet Hadden. Picture it, a grand colonial-style house in the quiet New York suburb. There's a Cadillac in the driveway and a well-manicured lawn. But if you step inside, the smell of gin is heavy in the air. You hear the sound of a father's belt and a mother's high-pitched laughter as she forces her young son into a silk dress, telling him he's much lovelier as a girl than he is as a disappointing boy. This wasn't a bad home, it was a laboratory for a serial killer. Hadden Irving Clark was born on July 31st, 1952, in Troy, New York. He was the second of 4 children born to Hadden Clark Sr., a chemist and a Korean War veteran, and Flavia Clark. The circumstances surrounding Hadden's birth and early infancy were reportedly fraught with complications. His mother Flavia later claimed that Hadden had a bad forceps delivery during birth. She believed this resulted in a head injury and potential brain damage, which she often used to explain or blame his erratic behavior as he grew older. While the family appeared to be the standard affluent blue-blooded American family on the surface, both parents were alcoholics who engaged in frequent physical fights in front of their 4 children. While drinking, Hadden Sr. was verbally and physically abusive. He frequently referred to Hadden as the retard and would beat him with his belt. Flavia Clark, when she was drunk, would force Hadden into frilly dresses and feminine attire. During these episodes, she would refuse to acknowledge Hadden, instead calling him Kristen. Flavia Clark reportedly had a deep-seated pathological desire for a daughter. When she gave birth to 4 boys, she didn't simply accept her reality. She attempted to override it. While Hadden was primarily the target, reports from family members' biographers suggest that all the Clark brothers were subjected to Flavia's forced cross-dressing at different points in their childhood. Flavia would reportedly dress the boys up simultaneously and judge them. She would tell them who looked the most feminine and who was the biggest disappointment for looking like a boy. It wasn't about gender exploration or play, it was a form of narcissistic ownership. She wanted what she wanted, and she used her children as living dolls to satisfy her own whims, regardless of the psychological damage it caused them. While all the brothers experienced the trauma, it stuck to Hadden the most, because Flavia viewed Hadden as the broken from birth. Now I want to draw a comparison to one of my favorite horror movies, Sleepaway Camp. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. In the movie Sleepaway Camp, the protagonist, Peter, is sent to live with his eccentric Aunt Martha after his family dies. Martha, who already has a son and always wanted a girl, simply decides that Peter will now be Angela. She forces him into dresses and pigtails, punishing him if he breaks the feminine facade. This is the exact God-complex manipulation Hadden's mother Flavia exerted. Like Martha, Flavia didn't view her sons as people, but as clay to be molded into daughters that she wanted. You can argue that both Martha and Flavia committed a form of identity homicide long before any physical blood was spilled. They erased the boy to create the girl, leaving a psychological void where a healthy ego should have been. Hadden Sr. would beat the boys specifically for the behavior their mother encouraged. Hadden, being the most socially off and sensitive of the group, became the ultimate scapegoat in this tug of war between his parents. In a house where the father was a violent, mean drunk, Hadden found that being Christian was the only way to get his mother on his side. It was a survival tactic, and it eventually split his personality in two. The irony of the Clark household is that they did eventually have a daughter, but she was the youngest. By the time she arrived, the psychological damage to the older boys, specifically Hadden and Bradenfield, his brother, had already calcified. They had been taught that their male identities were shameful and that femininity was a costume used to appease the predator. Later in life, Hadden would claim that Kristen was a separate persona who lived inside him and was responsible for most of the violent acts that he committed. While all of this was happening behind closed doors, the family maintained their blue blood reputation in their affluent neighborhood, making Hadden's internal reality feel even more isolated and surreal. Hadden's father, Hadden Sr., was highly educated but struggled with alcoholism and a violent temper. Because his father was unhappy with his pay, he frequently changed jobs, meaning the family moved constantly, sometimes twice a year, preventing young Hadden from ever forming stable roots or friendships outside the home. Hadden Clark's school years were marked by severe social isolation and a reputation for being different. His experiences in the classroom and on the playground were a direct extension of the instability and trauma he faced at home. He frequently was picked on and called derogatory names by other students. The external rejection mirrored the verbal abuse his father gave him, who often called him the retard at home. Hadden's time in school was also hindered by his internal struggles and the labels that were placed on him by his parents. His mother's insistence he was born brain damaged due to the forceps delivery became a self-fulfilling prophecy in his academic life. He struggled to keep up with his peers and felt fundamentally broken. Hadden Clark's weirdness wasn't just the type of social awkwardness. It was an unsettling mix of profound developmental delays, macabre fixations, and a total lack of social boundaries. By the time he reached his teens, he had become a neighborhood boogeyman, a person people avoided not just because he was strange, but because he felt dangerous. Hadden had a disturbing relationship with blood and physical injury. One of the most famous stories involves Hadden deliberately ramming his brother with a bicycle. Instead of helping or running away, Hadden stood over the top of him, watching him bleed with a look of intense clinical fascination. There were reports from the neighborhood children that Hadden had once caught a bird, killed it, and sucked its blood. Whether literal or part of a local mythology surrounding him, it highlights his predatory aura that he was projecting. While other kids were playing sports, Hadden spent his time in the woods behind the affluent homes. He was obsessed with how things were put together inside. He didn't just kill animals, he processed them. He would skin and dissect neighborhood pets and wildlife, displaying a level of anatomical interest that would later manifest in the surgical way he treated his human victims. He also preferred the company of the forest to actual people. He would disappear for hours behind the homes, behind the school, and he would build strange shrines or camps, a habitat that he would live in. This continued into adulthood when he lived in the woods or in his truck despite having access to his family's money. Hadden also had a physical presence that people found deeply off-putting. He had a pronounced speech impediment and often smelled like the outdoors or unwashed clothes. This made him an easy target for bullying, but it also made him invisible. People would literally look the other way across the street to avoid the smelly kid, which allowed him to observe people without being noticed. Display of his oddness, he reportedly kept a pet raccoon that he trained to sit on top of his head, a rare moment of companionship that the neighbors found deeply unsettling rather than charming. I mean, the raccoon thing, I can get behind that. Everything else, no. Pierce described him as having a flat personality. He didn't laugh at jokes or react to social cues. He just simply stared. This dead-eyed stare became a hallmark of his adult mugshots and police interviews. Though the cross-dressing was forced upon him by his mother in private, it began to leak into his public persona in strange ways. He was known to steal women's underwear from clotheslines or laundry rooms in the neighborhood. He realized early on that people, especially authority figures, were confused by his gender expression. He began to use the weirdness as a shield. If people thought he was just a crazy guy in a wig, they didn't realize, in reality, he was a calculated predator. Hadden's sense of humor was dark and vengeful. If a neighbor slighted him, he wouldn't just argue. He would leave dead animals on their doorsteps, sabotage their property in ways that felt creepy rather than mischievous. He reportedly took a used sanitary napkin and placed it inside a sandwich of a student who teased him. Now we start to see Hadden's internal struggle with his gender identity and predatory instincts to begin to merge in the legal way. He was caught peering into windows of girls' homes in his neighborhood. While the police at the time viewed it as the creepy kid issue, it was actually the first formal record of Hadden hunting, learning how to watch victims without their knowledge, a skill he would later use to stalk his victims. Now, keep in mind, he was still in school while all this was building up. So let's go ahead and finish the story of his high school time. Hadden Clark's high school years were essentially a prolonged exercise in humiliation and social failure. While most teenagers are navigating the typical hurdles of adolescence, Hadden was a 20-year-old super senior struggling with a single second degree reading level. So I said that kind of weird. Let me say it backwards. So the super senior, he was struggling with a second grade reading level. There we go. Because he had been held back twice due to learning disabilities and the constant family moves, Hadden didn't graduate from high school until he was 21 years old. With him being significantly older and larger than his classmates, it made him stand out in a way that invited mockery. Students called him the retard, echoing the slurs the father used at home. The environment turned the school into a place of constant defense for Hadden, feeling his resentment towards normal people. He spent his lunch hours and free time alone, often retreating to the woods behind the school buildings. This reinforced his identity as a forest creature rather than a member of community. After struggling through high school and graduating at the ripe age of 21, Hadden Clark was a man without a compass. In 1974, he enrolled in the Culinary Institute of America, CIA for short. On paper, this looked like a positive step towards a career. In reality, it was where Hadden's weirdness was given a set of professional tools. The CIA is one of the most prestigious cooking schools in the world, known for its rigorous standards. For Hadden, the attraction wasn't the art of cooking, it was the butchery. Hadden excelled in meat cutting and anatomical breakdown. He was fascinated with the process of deboning and cleaning a carcass. While the other students were focused on the flavors, Hadden was focused on the blade. He reportedly had an obsessive relationship with his knives, keeping them sharpened to a razor's edge and treating them with more care than he treated people. His hygiene issues followed him from high school. In a field where sanitation is everything, Hadden was known for being filthy. He often had dirt under his fingernails and wore grease-stained uniforms, which led to constant friction between instructors and his peers. He was also known to talk to himself while working on the line. Classmates recalled him whispering to his knives or his ingredients, retreating into the Kristen persona when the stress of the kitchen became too much. Hadden's habit of biological retaliation reached a new level at the CIA. When he felt slighted by a classmate, he didn't just get angry, he used his access to the food supply. There are stories of Hadden polluting the dishes of the students he disliked. Sometimes he would use cleaning chemicals, other times he would use body fluids. Cringe. Despite his bizarre behavior and obvious mental instability, Hadden actually graduated in 1976. He left the school with a degree and a technical skill to disarticulate a body with the speed and efficiency of a professional butcher. Well, let me back that up. He left the school with a degree and technical skill to disarticulate a body with the speed and efficiency of a professional butcher. There we go. His professional career in life was a jarring juxtaposition. He possessed the refined skills of a high-end chef, but lived a lifestyle that was a transient person, living on the absolute fringes of society. This drifter phase is where his potential for violence truly began to simmer. See what I did there? Because of his Culinary Institute of America degree, CIA, wanted to back it up and make sure we knew what we were talking about, and not like the CIA. Hadden could land jobs that most people would be envious of. He worked at prestigious locations, including in Maryland, the University Club in Washington, D.C. He also worked on private yachts as a personal chef. These luxury boats were in the middle of the ocean, isolated with small groups of people, which is kind of terrifying in hindsight. However, he rarely lasted more than a few months at any job. He was frequently fired for his bizarre behavior, which included talking to himself and having violent outbursts or scaring the waitstaff. His chef jobs were often where the Kristen persona would manifest as a survival mechanism. When the high-pressure environment of the kitchen triggered his paranoid schizophrenia, Hadden would check out and Kristen would check in. Also, co-workers reportedly found women's clothing and wigs in his employee lockers. He developed a specific hatred for women in positions of authority in the kitchen. He would often sabotage their prep work or leave them presents like dead animals or contaminated food at their stations, a direct callback to his childhood retaliation habits. One of the more unsettling details of his chef era was his obsession with waste. Hadden would have a notorious reputation of being a dumpster diver. He would scavenge for food and items in the trash behind the hotels where he worked. This behavior showed a complete breakdown of social norms regarding what is consumable and what is trash. Investigators later believed that this lack of boundaries between food and refuse played into his eventual cannibalistic acts. Despite coming from a family with money and earning a decent wage as a chef, Hadden rejected traditional housing. He lived in a state of self-imposed homelessness. He lived out of a beat-up pickup truck that was overflowing with trash, stolen women's clothing, and his professional knife rolls. He would park in a hospital parking lots on the edges of the suburban neighborhoods and blend in as a harmless eccentric. He was a woodsman in the creepiest sense. He knew the small pockets of forest behind Maryland's affluent housing developments better than the people who lived there. He would set up hidden campsites where he would sit and watch the backyards of houses, learning the rhythms of the family, including the family of his first known victim. In a desperate attempt to find structure, or perhaps seeking his father's approval, he turned to the U.S. Navy. If his childhood was a laboratory for trauma, his military service was a place where his fractured psyche finally began to shatter in public. Enlisting in the Navy was a strange choice for someone with Hadden's history. His father, Hadden Sr., had been a veteran and was likely an internal pressure to straighten him out through military service. However, the rigid, hypermasculine environment of the Navy was the exact opposite of what Hadden's fragile mind could handle. While the Navy demanded conformity, Hadden's internal world was becoming more chaotic. The Chris persona, the female identity his mother had forced on him, hadn't disappeared. Instead, it became a source of extreme conflict. Reports suggest Hadden continued to struggle with his gender identity while on active duty. Just as in high school, he was the weird guy in the barracks. He was noted for his poor hygiene, his 1,000-yard stare, and his inability to follow basic social cues, a frequent target for his fellow sailors. The pressure of military life acted as a catalyst for his dormant mental illness. It wasn't long before his behavior became too erratic for the Navy to ignore. He began exhibiting signs of paranoid schizophrenia. He felt persecuted by his superiors and believed his fellow sailors were conspiring against him. During his service, Hadden had finally been sent for psychiatric evaluation. It was here that he received a formal diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. The Navy realized very quickly that Hadden was not military material, he was a liability. And after a short period of service, he was granted a medical discharge based on his mental health diagnosis. After the Navy sent him packing with his medical discharge and diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, Hadden found himself back into the civilian world more adrift than ever. While Hadden was drifting between kitchens and living in his truck, the Clark climate curse manifested itself in a horribly public way. In 1984, his older brother, Bradfield Clark, proved that the violence brewing in their childhood home was not just unique to Hadden. Bradfield Clark was often seen as a more successful brother. He had a steady job as a software engineer in the Silicon Valley, living in a quiet apartment in Mountain View, California. But like Hadden, Bradfield possessed a deep-seated resentment towards women and had a fractured sense of reality. In 1984, Bradfield invited a coworker, Trish Galvin, over to his apartment for dinner. He had been harboring an unrequited crush on her, but when she made it clear she wasn't interested in him romantically, Bradfield's polite veneer shattered. Bradfield strangled Trish to death, but it wasn't the act of murder. It truly mirrors Hadden's later depravity. It's what happened afterwards. Using the skills he seemed to similarly have in common with Hadden, the anatomical fascinations shown since childhood, Bradfield dismembered Trish's body in a bathtub. But most disturbingly, Bradfield cooked and ate parts of her body. He later claimed that he did this because he quote-unquote loved her and wanted to keep her as a part of him forever. Unlike Hadden, who was a master of evasion and lying, Bradfield eventually buckled under the weight of his own actions. After attempting suicide, he called the police and confessed the entire ordeal. He was sentenced in life to prison. At the time of Bradfield's arrest, Hadden was already struggling with his mental health. Criminologists argue that Bradfield's crimes provided a blueprint for Hadden in the future. Also for Hadden, his brother's cannibalism wasn't just a headline. It was a dark confirmation that the violent urges he felt were a family trait. It lowered the psychological threshold for Hadden to cross the same line. For the brothers, the cannibalism wasn't about a hunger, it was about a narcissistic control. Because their mother Flavia had systematically erased their true identities through the forced cross-dressing and psychological games the brothers grew up with. By consuming a victim, the brothers were attempting a primitive form of incorporation. They believed that by eating a piece of someone whole or successful or the innocent, they could fill a void that was left behind by their mother's abuse. Both brothers were obsessed with the process of the body. They didn't view their victims as humans, but as anatomical projects. Hadden's culinary training allowed him to treat cannibalism like a technical skill. He used his professional tools to break down the victims with a level of attachment that made it feel like more of a chore than a crime. There is a theory that Hadden felt a twisted need to outdo his brother. If Bradfield could kill and eat one person, Hadden would kill many more and hide them so well that he would never be found. But we'll get into this later. While the 1986 murder of Michelle Dorr is his first official conviction, Hadden Clark's trail of breadcrumbs starts much earlier. Before he was a killer, he was a prolific petty criminal, a stalker, and if his own confessions are to be believed, he killed for the first time when he was just 14 years old. He claimed that he killed a young boy in his neighborhood. Most chillingly, Hadden alleged that his father, Hadden Sr., found out and helped him dispose of the body. While nobody was ever found to confirm the story fits the Clark family dynamic of secrets and shared darkness. It would explain why Hadden felt so uncomfortable and untouchable for so long. Hadden was also a compulsive thief, but he didn't steal for money, he stole for identity. He had a decades-long history of stealing women's clothing and lingerie from clothing lines and laundromat. He was arrested multiple times for shoplifting items that seemed useless to a man living in a truck. Makeup, perfume, jewelry, these were all the building blocks for the Kristen persona. To truly understand the Kristen persona, you have to look at it as more than just a disguise. For Hadden, Kristen was a psychological fortress, a separate identity that held all the pleasures and sins that Hadden, the rejected and abused son, couldn't handle. In his own mind, Hadden was a failure, and Kristen was the survivor. As we touched on, the persona was a gift from his mother, Flavia. When she was drunk and abusive, Hadden only received love or positive attention when he was ceasing to be Hadden and became Kristen. Psychologists believe this created the dissociative break in the Navy and later in the kitchen. When the world would become too stressful or Hadden felt he was about to be attacked, he would flip the switch. He often referred to her as Kristen Blue Flynn. The specificity of the name suggested a fully realized internal life. He didn't just put on a wig, he inhabited a different story. Hadden didn't just wear women's clothes, he had a very specific look for Kristen that was deeply unsettling to those who had saw it. Kristen wasn't a hypersexualized persona. He often wore floral dresses, sensible shoes, and a silver or blonde wig. This made him look like a non-threatening elderly woman from a distance, the perfect camouflage for a predator. He was also known to wear heavy, cheap perfume when he was Kristen. It was a sensory way to drown out his own Hadden smell and fully immerse himself into the character. During police investigations and interrogations, Hadden would claim he didn't remember the murders. He would say, "I didn't do that. Kristen did that." He treated Kristen as a separate entity that had no control. Now that we understand a little bit about his background, we can move into his murders. And hold on, it's going to be a little bit rough, this first one. The disappearance of Michelle Dorr is the moment the weird neighbor transitioned into the nightmare. On May 31st, 1986, in a suburban neighborhood of Silver Spring, Maryland, 6-year-old Michelle was playing in a plastic wading pool in her backyard, and she was wearing a pink polka-dotted swimsuit. Within minutes, she vanished into thin air. At the time, Hadden Clark's other brother, Jeff, lived in a house directly next door to the Doors. Hadden was staying there temporarily, sleeping in his truck or in the basement. Michelle's father, Carl Dorr, had gone inside for a few moments to make a phone call. In that tiny window, Hadden, who had been watching the neighborhood children for weeks, lured Michelle into his brother's house. What happened inside that house had remained a secret for over a decade. Hadden used his culinary training to murder Michelle and then chillingly process the scene. He used his professional knives to dismember her, a task he pleaded with the speed of a trained chef. Hadden reportedly told his cellmate, spoiler alert, he does get caught, his cellmate Jack Truitt, who reportedly looked just like Jesus, and this comes into play later, that he used his culinary skills to do the unthinkable. What he described was, he claimed that after dismembering Michelle, he kept certain parts of her body. He allegedly confessed to cooking and eating her heart. He reportedly told Truitt that he wanted to keep her with him forever, which is echoing exactly the sentiment his brother Bradfield used after murdering Trish Gavin. He described the act not as a murder, but as a meal, utilizing the butchery techniques he had perfected at the Culinary Institute of America. By the time Hadden killed Michelle in 1986, his brother Bradfield had already been convicted for the murder of Trish Galvin in 1984. And investigators believe Hadden was obsessed with his brother's quote-unquote legacy. The fact that both brothers were raised by the same mother who were forced into dresses and the same abusive alcoholic father both turned to cannibalism points to a shared, deep-seated psychological pathology involving the incorporation of victims. So beyond eating the tissue, Hadden also had made claims about drinking Michelle's blood. He allegedly told investigators that he drank her blood like a vampire. This connects back to the childhood red flag where he reportedly killed a bird and sucked its blood. It suggests that Hadden's lust for blood was a source of power or a way to satisfy a thirst that he had been brewing since childhood. Now let's talk about the catastrophe that was the investigation into Michelle Dorr's disappearance and later discovered death. Because there was no sign of a struggle and no witnesses, the police focused heavily on Michelle's father, Carl Dorr. They spent years hounding him, believing he had killed his daughter in a fit of rage. This trauma destroyed his life and his reputation. Hadden was questioned, but since he was so weird and socially off, the police dismissed him as a harmless local eccentric. They couldn't conceive that a man living in a dirty truck had the surgical precision to commit these super clean crimes. While the police were looking at Carl Dorr, the physical evidence was literally beneath their feet. Years later, when forensic technology improved, investigators returned to Jeff Clark's house. Underneath the bedroom carpet and the floorboards, they found a map of the murder. Even though Hadden had scrubbed the surfaces with diligence of a professional kitchen porter, the blood had seeped into the porous wood. Neighbors also recall seeing a strange woman in the area around the time Michelle vanished. In hindsight, it was almost certainly Hadden in his wig and dress, moving things and such back to his truck. For 14 years, Michelle Dorr was a missing person. Hadden used his woodsman skill and knowledge to take her remains deep into a park in Silver Spring. He didn't just bury her, he ritualized the site. He placed her remains in a shallow grave and covered them with heavy stones, creating a shrine he could return to. It wasn't until 1999, when Hadden was already in prison for the murder of Laura Hoteling, that he finally confessed. Even then, he played games. He led the police on several wild goose chases before Kristen finally pointed to the correct location. In a grim televised moment, investigators followed Hadden, who was wearing a dress and a wig at the time, into the woods of Acorn Hill Park. They found what was left of Michelle, a few bones, her skull, and the remnants of a pink polka-dotted swimsuit. When asked why, Hadden gave a chillingly detached answer. He claimed he didn't like the noise children make. I mean, come on. Who does? Who likes the noise children make? But buddy, you don't murder them, and you definitely don't eat them. So let's talk about a few things that happened between his two confirmed and convicted murders. The death of his father, Hadden Clark Sr., is a dark circle moment for the Clark family saga. It occurred in 1988, a pivotal time between Hadden's two famous murders, as we said. Hadden Sr. ended his life in a way that many found symbolically chilling. He committed suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning in his car. He parked in the woods of Connecticut and took his own life. The suicide took place just 2 years after the disappearance took two. The suicide took place just 2 years after the disappearance of Michelle Dorr. Side note: I'm trying to be like a little less rigid and keeping in a couple of my like bloopers. Let me know if it's good or not. I don't know. It makes it more like natural, I think. All right. Anyways, back to the story. While no one knows for sure what was in his father's final note, investigators and biographers believe that the weight of his son's actions, Bradfield in '84, and the growing suspicion that Hadden was following the same path had become too much for him to bear. For our boy Hadden Jr., his father's suicide wasn't a moment of grief, as so much it was a release from a monster. Hadden Sr. was the only person Hadden Jr. truly feared. He was a violent, authoritative, mean drunk who kept Hadden's most public outbursts in check through physical intimidation. With his father gone, Hadden's behavior became significantly more erratic. He began living out of his truck full time and deepening his woodsman's persona. In '88, the same year of his father's suicide, Hadden Clark's relationship with his mother, Flavia, reached the violent breaking point. This confrontation is often cited as a key moment in his psychological collapse. The fight began over something seemingly mundane, a dispute about having living in his truck on his brother's property. However, it quickly escalated into a scene that mirrored the horror of his crimes. During the argument, Hagen's rage boiled over. He reportedly attacked Flavia, choking her and threatening her with one of his professional knives. Hadden later claimed that Kristen was the one who was angry. He felt his mother was abandoning him after his father's death, and he lashed out at the woman who had spent years manipulating him into this identity. Flavia managed to escape and eventually filed for a restraining order. This was a significant turning point. The mother who had created Kristen now feared her. Hadden was officially outcast from the family circle, leaving him homeless and untethered. In 1989, Hadden Clark's paranoia and woodsman tendencies moved indoors. He began leasing a house in Silver Spring, Maryland, but instead of making it a home, he turned it into a fortress of traps. The landlord couldn't deal with his weird shit and did not renew his lease and forced him out. When the landlord eventually regained access to the property, they discovered that Hadden had spent his time there preparing for a quote-unquote invasion. He didn't just change the locks, he engineered the house to be a death trap for anyone entering without his specific knowledge. Hadden rigged various rooms with thin fishing lines connecting to heavy objects or sharp tools designed to fall on intruders. They were designed to be at eye level or neck level, intended to incapacitate or kill anyone walking through a darkened hallway. He had also carved out spaces behind the walls and under floorboards where he could hide and watch the intruders he imagined coming for him. In his mind, these traps were for them, the people that he believed were stalking him. In reality, they were a physical manifestation of his paranoid schizophrenia. He later claimed that Kristen helped him set the traps because Hadden was too, quote-unquote, slow to protect himself. Just as Hadden's behavior was becoming more erratic and dangerous, he committed a crime that showcased his utter lack of empathy and willingness to target the vulnerable. He robbed an elderly woman at St. Bernadette Catholic Church in Silver Spring, Maryland, the very same parish where the Dorr family, his first victim, were members. Hadden had approached her and, with his sudden and physical aggression, snatched her purse. When she tried to resist or was simply too slow to react, he became more physically aggressive. Witnesses and police reports noted that Hadden was often seen loitering around the church, wearing women's clothing and wigs. He used his Christian persona as a disguise to blend in to appear harmless before striking. This incident led to his arrest and the taking of his fingerprints, which becomes really important later on. So we'll talk about that. Well, actually, we'll talk about that right now. The murder of Laura Hoteling in October 1992 is the climax of the Hadden Clark story. It's in this moment where his Christian persona and his culinary skills and his woodsman skills fail him. By this time, Hadden had been working as a part-time gardener for Laura's mother, Penny, in their affluent Bethesda, Maryland home. He was the helpful, quiet guy who knew the layout of the house and the patterns of the family. On the morning of October 18th, 1992, Laura, a 23-year-old Harvard graduate with a bright future, didn't show up for her local nonprofit job. When her mother checked her room, everything seemed normal, but Laura was gone. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, and no forced entry. A neighbor reportedly seeing Laura walking away from the house that morning, wearing her signature long coat and a wig. The report initially led police to believe that she had simply run away or left voluntarily. In reality, the woman the neighbor saw wasn't Laura. It was Hadden Clark. Hadden utilized this tactic he perfected since childhood. He donned a wig and Laura's clothing to walk out of the house in broad daylight. So this is where some conflicting information came in, but from what I understand, like he was already wearing Laura's clothes. He had got it from the mother or something along those lines, where he stole them. So while he's like doing this to Laura, like he's already wearing her clothes, and allegedly he told Laura to call him Laura. It was all some kind of weird, twisted things where he wanted to like have Laura's mom, Penny, as his mom because his life was so fucked. So he didn't just kill her; like he staged like this exit for himself by wearing her clothes. So obviously, it's a classic example of how he used his gender identity as a tactic and a tool for evasion. After killing Laura, he didn't dispose of her body immediately. He used his professional grade knives and began the process of the breakdown of the body. Investigators were struck by how little blood was actually found at the scene. This was because Hadden understood anatomy. He knew where to cut the bones and the veins and all that stuff to minimize like the blood flow from the body. After dismembering Laura in the basement of her own home, Hadden used his signature disposal techniques of using plastic 5-gallon buckets. So think about the 5-gallon buckets. It's like the orange buckets you get from Home Depot. If you know, you know. He was also known to use chemicals and tight sealing lids to ensure that there's no scent of decay that would emanate from his truck as he drove to the disposal site. He didn't choose a random spot. He drove to a wooded area near Dulles Toll Road in Virginia, and he dug a shallow grave in that location that was hidden from the road but accessible to him. Using his woodsman skills, he didn't just throw dirt over here. He meticulously covered the grave with leaves, branches, and forest debris to make it look undisturbed. He wanted the site to age into the forest floor, so it would be invisible to hikers or any workers or anyone that was in the area. While Hadden was less public about his cannibalism involving Hoteling case than he was with Michelle Dore's case, his cellmates later provided a horrifying testimony about his post-murder rituals. Hadden had allegedly confessed to consuming parts of Laurel's internal organs, specifically her heart. To Hadden, this wasn't just about hunger, it was about the incorporation. He believed that by eating a piece of his victim, he was taking their life force and keeping them inside him and Kristen forever. More on that. Psychologically, Hadden suggested that it wasn't Hadden who ate the victims, it was Kristen. He described Kristen as having a hunger that he had to satisfy. In his mind, cannibalism was the way to make Kristen persona stronger. By consuming these young women, he was trying to absorb their qualities that he felt he lacked: beauty, intelligence, and social acceptance. Hadden was a professional at cleaning crime scenes due to his culinary background, but forensic science caught a mistake that he didn't know he made. Detectives found a bloody pillowcase that Hadden had tried to hide or wash, and on that fabric was a single high-quality latent fingerprint. Because Hadden had the prior record for shoplifting women's underwear and the peeping Tom incidents and all the other weird shit that he did, his prints were in the AFIS, or Automated Fingerprint Identification System database. The match to Hodeling's family part-time gardener was the investigation's first major break. Also, in Laura's hairbrush, police found a strand of synthetic hair fiber, and it didn't match Laura's hair, but was later linked to the cheap wigs that Hadden had been using for his persona of Kristen. The interrogation of Hadden Clark is one of the most surreal and disturbing chapters in American forensic psychology. It wasn't a standard back and forth between a detective and a suspect. It was a delicate negotiation between law enforcement and a fractured psyche that required a total suspension of traditional police procedure. When Hadden was first arrested for the murder of Laura, he was a stone wall. He sat in the interrogation room, rocking back and forth, staring at the floor, and occasionally mumbling about his rights or religious delusions. So Detective Charles Chuck, we'll call him Chuck Ness, realized that Hadden wasn't going to crack under pressure. Instead, Ness leaned into Hadden's weirdness, and he noticed that Hadden seemed uncomfortable in his own skin, as if Hadden was a suit he didn't want to wear. He eventually made a bizarre demand. He would only talk if he could have his quote unquote things from his truck. He wanted his blonde wig and a floral dress. In a controversial move that could be jeopardizing to the case if handled poorly, good old Chuck Ness allowed it. He realized that Hatton's ego was tied to the Kristen persona and that Kristen was the one that had all the secrets. As soon as Hadden put on the wig, the transformation was physical. His voice jumped an octave into a breathy, high-pitched feminine tone. He stopped rocking and became eerily calm. He began referring to Hadden as a separate, clumsy person. Speaking as Kristen, he began to treat the detectives like friends. He told them that Hadden was a bad boy, and Hadden did things he wasn't supposed to, but Kristen knew where the pretty things were. The detectives had to play along with the delusion to get the location of Laura's body. They would ask questions like, Kristen, can you help us find where Hadden put the girl? We want to make sure she's okay. Hadden, as Kristen, would giggle and drop cryptic hints, describing the smell of woods or the sound of a highway. He described the murder not as a violent act, but as a disappearing act that Kristen had watched Hadden perform. During the interrogation, the detectives confronted Kristen with a piece of evidence that Hadden's side of the brain had overlooked. Hadden had a checkbook in his truck, and the memo line there was a purchase for duct tape, garbage bags, and rope. He'd actually written in the memo line, Laura. When shown this, Kristen became agitated. The persona started to slip, and Hadden's deeper, more aggressive voice leaked through. It was the only time during the interrogation that the mask truly cracked, showing the rage beneath the floral dress. While the Kristen interrogation got him a conviction for Laura, it didn't solve the Michelle Dorr case. That required a second, even stranger interrogation years later in prison. Police placed Hadden with Jack Truitt, a man who looked exactly like the Western image of Jesus. Hadden, who was deeply religious in a paranoid way, believed Truitt was the Messiah. He began confessing his sins to Truitt. Truitt was wearing a wire, and on those tapes, Hadden finally dropped the Kristen act and spoke as himself, detailing how he killed Michelle Dorr and how he had eaten her heart and where her remains were hidden. While Hadden Clark was only convicted for the murders of Michelle Dorr and Laura Hoteling, both he and investigators believe his true crime count is much higher. In prison, Hadden has made various claims, ranging from a few additional victims to over 30 murders spanning several decades. So here are some potential cases and quote-unquote confessions that keep his file open as a suspected serial killer. For years, Hadden was primarily the suspect in one of the most famous cold cases in American history, the Lady of the Dunes, a woman found murdered and mutilated in Provincetown, Massachusetts in 1974. Hadden's grandfather owned property in Provincetown, and Hadden had spent the summers there. The victim's hands had been removed surgically, a detail that matched Hadden's later methods. In 2022, DNA evidence was finally identified the victim as Ruth Marie Terry and linked the murder to her husband, Guy Medalvin. While Hadden was cleared of this specific case, investigators still believe he has committed several other anatomical murders in the Cape Cod area around the 70s. The most damning evidence that Hadden has killed more people is the bucket of over 200 items found in his grandfather's property. The bucket contained rings, watches, and necklaces and other jewelry, and only a small fraction belonged to Michelle and Laura. Police believe each piece of jewelry represents a trophy from a burglary, a stalking victim, or a murder. Hadden claimed many of these items belonged to women that he, quote-unquote, disappeared while working as a chef on the East Coast and on private yachts. From his cell at the Eastern Correctional Institute in Maryland, Hadden has drawn maps and written letters claiming to a total of 30 to 35 victims. Like I said, he's provided these hand-drawn maps to investigators showing burial sites across Maryland, Virginia, and New York. While some led to just trophy caches, others led to empty holes, leading to police to wonder if he had moved the bodies or if he was simply just hunting for attention. He claims many of his victims were drifters or people from the queer community. people he felt society wouldn't miss, mirroring the logic used by other serial killers like our boy Ronald Dominique from episode 1. And investigators have looked into Hadden's possible connection to a 1982 murder of a woman in Maryland whose body was found near the Hiawatha area. The victim was dismembered with the same butcher-like precision Hadden displayed. However, without a confession or a DNA link, it remains uncharged. Hadden Clark's journey through the justice system was as bizarre as his fragmented personality. Because he was a serial killer who operated in bursts or activity over decades, his convictions came in stages, eventually ensuring that he would never breathe fresh air again. The 92 murder case of Laura Hoatling was the anchor case that finally stopped Hadden. In 93, Hadden was convicted of second-degree murder. Despite the gruesome nature of the dismemberment, the prosecution struggled with the lack of premeditation and evidence at the time. So evidence of premeditation. So that's why he got it lame. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. And at the time, he was a really good fear that he would get off for good behavior on parole. And he could be back out on the street, which no one needs. As we kind of touched on before, while Hadden was serving time for Laura, that's when he met Jesus, Jack Turrett, and the discovery of the jewelry bucket finally linked him to the 1986 disappearance of Michelle Dorr. Faced with a map of blood found on the floorboards of his brother's old house, his own recorded confession to Turrett, he had to plead guilty. He received an additional 30 years for the murder of Michelle Dorr. Combined with his previous sentences, effectively turned it into a life sentence, ensuring that he remained behind bars until at least 2052, long past his natural life expectancy. As of 2025, Hadden Clark is 73 years old. He is currently incarcerated at the Easton Correctional Institute, ECI, in Westover, Maryland, a medium security facility. Reports from the prison suggest that Hadden's mental health has continued to fluctuate. He remains a diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic. He is reportedly still obsessed with his Christian persona, though the prison environment limits his ability to express it. Hadden spends much of his time writing letters to investigators, journalists, and even families of missing people. That's creepy. The queer killer narrative of Hadden Clark ends in his lonely cell, but the legacy remains as a chilling study. For the case is still used in police training to highlight how tunnel vision and dismissive behavior of weird suspects can allow a serial predator to continue hunting for years. And that, my kids, is the end of our telling of the Hadden Clark story. Thank you for joining me in the dark. If you enjoyed the episode, share it with your friends and leave a 5-star review on your favorite pod app. It helps the algorithm more than you know. And follow the show at Homicidal Tendency on Blue Sky, Instagram, Tumblr, and now we're on TikTok. Crazy, right? It'll have media from today's episode, and we'll be back next time with a new case. Until then, remember, spill the tea, not the blood.